Today we are going to share an incredible story of transformation, faith, and revelation. Imagine going through a near-death experience and discovering something so profound that it changes everything you believed. This is the journey of Rashid, who faced death and had a stunning revelation about Allah and his faith. Before we start, leave in the comments which city you are watching this video from, and, of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. My name is Rashid Al-Mansour, and I never imagined that my life would take the turn it did. I was born and raised in Dearborn, Michigan, a city that is almost a home away from home for many Arab immigrants like my family. Our culture, our faith, and our traditions were deeply rooted in who I was. At 47, I saw myself as an ordinary man, dedicated to my wife Aisha, my 2 teenage children, Omar and Layla, and my small business that has supported our family for decades. But life has a cruel way of destabilizing even the most solid foundations. It all started with persistent abdominal pain. At first, I ignored it. "It's just something I ate," I told Aisha, trying to minimize the worry in her eyes. But as the days turned into weeks, the pain increased, accompanied by weight loss that didn't make sense. My energy was running out quickly. Aisha insisted that I go to the doctor, but I resisted. "It's just stress," I repeated, more to convince myself than to reassure her. One morning, after almost fainting from the pain while helping a customer in the store, there was no more room for excuses. Aisha rushed me to the hospital. Sitting in the waiting room, surrounded by the smell of disinfectant and the distant sound of hospital machines, I felt fear rising in my chest, but nothing could prepare me for what I would hear that day. Dr. Henry Collins entered the room with a grave expression. He was a tall man with gray hair and a look that looked like he had been through a lot of difficult times with his patients. "Mr. Al-Mansour, thank you for coming. We need to talk about your test results." My mouth was dry, and Aisha held my hand tightly. As the doctor talked about the details of the diagnosis, it felt like my mind was on another frequency. But the keywords stood out like knives cutting through the silence. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, metastasis, palliative treatment. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Dr. Collins sighed. "It's difficult to predict, but without treatment, it could be a matter of months. With chemotherapy, perhaps we can prolong it a little." Aisha began to cry silently next to me, and I felt like my world was falling apart. How could this be happening to me? I have always been a man of faith, fulfilling my prayers, a good father and husband. My mind was flooded with questions. Why me? What did I do wrong? Is this a punishment? Over the next few days, life at home changed drastically. Silence took over our conversations, and even moments with my children were tinged with a sadness that I couldn't hide. Each night, I knelt down and prayed fervently. "Allah, give me strength. If it is your will for me to die, please allow me to understand why." However, deep down, the seed of doubt had already been planted. Something about this situation seemed to challenge everything I believed about divine justice and purpose, and little did I know that this was just the beginning. After the diagnosis, it seemed like life had lost color. Everything that once gave me purpose, my family, my work, my faith, now seemed shrouded in a fog of uncertainty. Every movement was an effort, every smile was forced, and every night brought a new kind of torment. The first night after the appointment, I sat alone in the store's small office, with the lights off, staring at the bookshelf my father had built decades ago. "Rashid," he used to say, "faith is the only shield man needs against the storms of life. But what about when the storm is terminal cancer?" My wife, Aisha, tried to be strong. She cooked meals I couldn't eat, stayed up with me when the nights were sleepless, and silently held my hands as I recited my prayers. But her eyes betrayed her. There was a desperation there, a fear she couldn't hide. One night, when we were in the living room after the kids had gone to bed, she finally said what she had been holding back. "Rashid, what are you going to do?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. "To do," I repeated, not fully understanding. "You're going to fight, right? You're going to get the treatments, for us, for me, for the children." I looked at her, and for a moment I wanted to lie. I wanted to say that everything would be fine, that I would face this bravely, and that everything would go back to normal. But instead, I let out a long sigh. Aisha, I don't even know what it's like to fight right now. Everything seems so out of my control. She held my hand tightly. Then trust in Allah, Rashid. He is greater than any diagnosis. He has a plan. I shook my head, but couldn't respond. Deep down, something inside me was conflicted. I had faith, or at least I thought I did. But why would Allah allow something like this? Why right now, when I felt like I was doing everything right? The nights that followed were worse. Lying in my bed, I stared at the ceiling, replaying all the memories of my life, my decisions, my mistakes, my victories. Everything seemed small compared to the vastness of the unknown that awaited me. One morning, I got out of bed and went to the prayer rug. I didn't recite anything by heart. I just spoke. Allah, I don't understand. I know I shouldn't question your wisdom, but please help me. If I am going to die, let me know the purpose of it. Let me see something beyond this suffering. Tears were streaming down my face. It wasn't common for me to cry, but there, alone, I felt like I was facing something much bigger than myself. The next morning, I decided to start treatment, not out of hope for a cure, but because Aisha needed it. My children needed this. The first day of chemotherapy was a test of physical and emotional endurance. As the substance entered my body, I prayed silently, asking for strength and, deep down, something more. Oh, if this be the end, may I see him before the end. That prayer would be answered in a way I could never have imagined. The first cycle of chemotherapy was exhausting. I felt as if every cell in my body was being drained of energy. The nausea was constant, and the metallic taste in the mouth made any food unbearable. Still, Aisha accompanied me to each session, holding my hand and whispering words of encouragement. It was during the third session that my life changed forever. That day, the chemotherapy room was particularly quiet. There were other patients around me, all in different stages of treatment, but I barely noticed them. I felt a strange pressure in my chest, something I initially attributed to stress and tiredness. I tried to ignore it, but the pain intensified. It was as if an invisible hand was squeezing my heart. Rashid, are you okay? Aisha asked, her voice full of concern. Before I could respond, the pain became unbearable. My field of vision began to darken at the edges, and I heard Aisha scream for help as I collapsed into the chair. When I regained some consciousness, I realized that I was no longer in control of my body. It was as if I were floating above the scene. I looked down and saw doctors and nurses around me, performing resuscitation maneuvers. A defibrillator was triggered, and my body on the stretcher gave a slight jump from the impact of the electrical shock. It was surreal. I knew that body was mine. But at the same time, I felt no emotional connection to it. Everything seemed distant, as if I were a passive observer of a movie scene. Then something caught my attention. A bright light appeared in the distance, like a portal opening in the darkness. The light was almost blinding in intensity, but it didn't hurt my eyes. In fact, it seemed to draw me in with a sense of warmth and peace. I started moving towards the light, or maybe it was the light that was approaching me. There was no longer the sound of machines or human voices, just a soft echo that faded into something familiar. The prayers my mother used to recite when I was a child. Subhanallah, I whispered, or so I thought, since my mouth wasn't moving. The feeling of peace was indescribable, something I had never experienced in life. The light completely enveloped me, and for a moment I thought I was in the presence of Allah. But that feeling was short-lived. The light began to dim, and the environment around me changed. The peaceful setting gave way to a dark and desolate landscape. It was as if all life had been drained from that place. The air was heavy, and a smell of rot permeated everything. I heard screams in the distance, screams that made me shake. I walked, or was led, towards the sound, and what I saw made my heart freeze. There were people I recognized, people who were long gone. Among them, my mother. She was on her knees, hands over her face, crying. His expression was one of pure suffering. "Mother!" I screamed, trying to reach her, but something stopped me from moving. And then, in the center of that desolate landscape, I saw something that shocked me even more. A throne. It was immense, but it wasn't as majestic as I imagined the divine throne would be. It was decayed, and on it, a prophet was chained. His face was filled with pain, and his eyes seemed to be begging for help. It was at that moment that a doubt began to arise within me, a doubt that questioned everything I believed. Suddenly, I felt a pull, as if I was being ripped away from that place. An electrical shock ran through my body, and my vision went dark. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in the hospital, surrounded by the worried faces of the doctors and Aisha. "Are you okay, Rashid?" one of the nurses asked, but I couldn't answer. All he could do was stare at the ceiling, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Returning to life was like waking up from a nightmare that didn't seem to end. As the doctors adjusted the machines around me and Aisha held my hand, all I could do was stare at the ceiling. My mind was stuck on that vision I had experienced, a place that seemed more real than the world around me. Over the next few days, as I recovered, that desolate landscape and the chained throne continued to haunt me. I began to question whether this was delirium caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain, as Dr. Collins, or something much deeper. Deep down, I knew this was more than just a hallucination. The first person I shared the experience with was Aisha. It was late at night, and she was sitting next to me in the hospital, reading the Quran in a low voice. "Aisha," I called, my voice weak. She looked at me, her eyes tired but attentive. "Yes, Rashid. I saw something." She leaned forward, worried. "What did you see?" I spoke slowly, choosing each word carefully. I told her about the light, the desolate place, the screams, and finally the throne with the prophet in chains. As he spoke, his face turned from concern to disbelief. "Rashid," she said, after a long silence, "that was just a dream. Your body was under great stress. Allah is merciful, and He would not put someone like you in a place like that." I wanted to believe her, but something inside me had changed. The prayers I always recited by heart now sounded empty, like words I didn't fully understand. A few days later, Imam Khalil, a family friend and respected religious leader, came to visit me in the hospital. Aisha had asked him to come to offer spiritual comfort. After some words of encouragement, he asked, "Rashid, Aisha told me you had a vision. Can you share it with me?" I was reluctant, but I ended up telling him. He listened carefully, nodding occasionally. When I finished, his response was firm but calm. "My brother," he began, "Allah tests the strong. What you saw may be a reflection of your own fears, something that the shaitan uses to weaken your faith. You must remain steadfast in your prayers and not allow these visions lead him astray." His eyes were full of compassion, but his words failed to dispel the weight in my chest. I knew he believed he was helping me, but that explanation didn't seem enough. The next night, as I tried to sleep, I had a vivid memory of that place. The figure of the chained prophet seemed to look directly at me, as if he wanted to tell me something but couldn't. "Why were you chained?" I asked out loud, as if someone could answer me. It was then that another memory of the vision came to light, the sound of screams. They were not just of pain, but of desperation, of people asking for redemption that never came. And among those voices, I recognized another, my own mother, calling my name. "Rashid," she screamed, her voice full of anguish. The tears started to roll down my face, and I felt a lump in my throat that seemed impossible to undo. My mother has always been a woman of faith, someone who dedicated her life to the service of Allah. Why would she be in a place like that? Over the next few days, my faith began to waver in a way I had never experienced. Prayers that were once automatic now seemed impossible to complete. Each word brought to mind questions I didn't know how to answer. Who really was Allah? What did the chained throne mean? Why was my mother in that place of suffering? That vision shook me in a way no one could understand, and I began to realize that maybe the answers I was looking for weren't where I always thought they would be. The days in the hospital became a tangle of silence and doubts. With each new visit from friends or family, I pretended to be at peace, answering their questions with generic phrases. But inside, a whirlwind of thoughts consumed me. My faith, once so solid, was cracking. The Quran, which had always been a comfort to me, now seemed like a distant text. The words no longer sounded like absolute truths, but like fragments of something bigger that I couldn't reach. One afternoon, still in the hospital, I asked for a Quran to be brought to me. Aisha was relieved, thinking that I was returning to my normal self. I took the book in my hands, feeling its familiar weight, and opened it at random. I read it quietly, trying to reconnect, but instead of finding comfort, I was overcome by a feeling of emptiness. The words seemed to echo something that I could no longer accept without question. It was at that moment that I realized my faith was not simply shaken. She was being destroyed, not because of a lack of belief, but because of something I didn't yet understand. The next day, Imam Khalil returned for another visit. He sat next to me, his face serene as always. After a few kind words, he asked directly, "Rashid, have you felt at peace since your experience?" I looked at him, hesitating. Finally, I decided to be honest. "No, Khalil, I don't feel peace. I feel confusion, doubt, and a heaviness I can't explain." The Imam leaned forward, his voice full of empathy. "It's normal, my brother. Your experience was traumatic, but remember that Allah tests those He loves. You need to strengthen your faith. Perhaps this is a call to draw closer to Him." "But what if—" My voice trailed off for a moment. What if what I saw wasn't a test? What if it was something I needed to interpret in a different way? The Imam frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "Shaitan is cunning, Rashid. He takes advantage of our moments of weakness to plant doubts. Don't be fooled." Those words, which would have comforted me before, now seemed insufficient. When he left, I felt an even greater emptiness. That night, as Aisha slept next to me, I decided to do something I had never done before. I asked Allah to show me the truth, no matter what it was. "If I'm wrong, guide me back to the right path," I whispered. "But if there's something I need to know, please show me." The next day, something unexpected happened. One of the nurses looking after me, a man named Daniel, noticed my pensive state and started a conversation. "Mr. Al-Mansour," he said, as he adjusted the devices beside me, "you seem worried. Do you want to talk?" I thought about refusing, but something about the genuine tone of his voice made me open the door a little. "Daniel," I began, "have you ever had doubts about your faith?" He smiled slightly. "Yes, often. I think that's part of being human. But I also believe that doubts can lead us to important discoveries, if we're willing to face them." That stayed in my mind. Maybe my doubts weren't signs of weakness, but of a path I needed to follow. Over the next few days, my prayers changed. There were no longer automatic requests for healing or salvation. There were cries for answers. Who are you, really? What do I need to understand? And why was my mother in that place of suffering? These questions echoed inside me like a mantra. I knew that, somehow, they were leading me to something greater, but I still had no idea what it was. My search for answers took an unexpected turn. After returning home, I was greeted with joy by my family and friends, but something inside me was still incomplete. The confusion and emotional weight of the near-death experience had not lessened. On the contrary, they seemed to intensify every day. One afternoon, as I rested on the living room sofa, Aisha brought a bowl of soup and sat down next to me. She seemed hesitant, like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. "Rashid," she began, breaking the silence, "Father Michael Carter is going to visit some patients at the hospital tomorrow. Maybe he can bring some comfort." I looked up at her, surprised. Aisha had always been deeply devoted to Islam and would never suggest anything like that. "Why do you think that would help?" I asked, my voice thick with curiosity. She shrugged, looking at the bowl in her hands. "I just want you to find peace, even if it comes from an unexpected place." I accepted the suggestion more out of curiosity than necessity. The next day, there he was, a calm-looking man with gray hair and a welcoming smile. He introduced himself simply. "I'm Father Michael Carter. I heard you had a powerful experience. I'm just here to listen, if you'd like to share." I recounted my vision carefully, watching his expression as he spoke. He didn't interrupt me once. He just nodded and listened attentively. When I finished, he was silent for a few moments, as if pondering his words. "Rashid," he began, "what you experienced is profound and meaningful. God often meets us in moments of extreme vulnerability, when we are willing to open our hearts. Perhaps what you saw was not a judgment, but an invitation." "An invitation to what?" I asked, confused. "To know the truth," he replied. "God is love, and He wants all of us to come to Him in sincerity. In John 14:6, Jesus said, 'I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Maybe he's calling you to something greater. Those words resonated with me in a way I didn't expect. Something inside me seemed to open, like a window letting in light. Over the next few weeks, I began to study Christianity in secret. I asked Daniel, the nurse, to bring me a Bible. He did so with an understanding smile, but without asking questions. I spent nights reading the Gospels, trying to understand who Jesus was and what he meant. The more I read, the more I felt like I was beginning to fill in the gaps my experience had left. The message of love and redemption seemed to speak directly to my heart. One night I had another dream. He was before the throne again, but this time the atmosphere was not somber. Light shone around me, and a figure appeared. He had a calm but powerful presence, and his eyes radiated compassion. "Fear not, Rashid," he said, in a voice that seemed to echo in my soul. "I am the truth you seek." When I woke up, I knew my journey was just beginning. After that dream, I woke up with a mixture of peace and restlessness. The figure that had appeared to me seemed so real that it was as if it were still present. His words echoed in my mind. "I am the truth you seek." From that moment on, the dreams became more frequent, almost like a nighttime dialogue. Each brought a new layer of understanding, but also raised new questions. In one of the dreams, I was walking along an ancient stone road. On both sides, there was a desolate landscape, similar to the place I had seen during my near-death experience. However, this time, the beaming figure walked beside me. "Why was my mother in that place of suffering?" I asked, my voice full of anguish. He looked at me with compassion. "She sought the truth, but was confused by traditions and dogma. Her pain is not an eternal judgment, but a calling to you, Rashid." These words brought me both comfort and weight. They made me feel like my journey was not just about me, but also about those who came before me and those who would come after. During the day, these revelations began to influence my routine. The Bible that Daniel had given me became a constant presence at my side. I read and reread the Gospels, trying to understand the depth of what was being revealed to me. One verse in particular impacted me deeply, John 8:32, "And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." These words felt like a direct response to what I was experiencing. The search for truth was not just an intellectual desire, but a spiritual need that I had never felt before. The other night I had a dream that seemed to be the climax of this series of revelations. I was once again before the throne, but this time it was not chained. The light around was intense, and I could feel a divine presence that transcends words. The radiant figure accompanying me reached out to me and said, "Embrace the truth, Rashid. Do not fear what you will lose, but rejoice in what you will find." I woke up at that moment with tears streaming down my face. The message was clear. I needed to make a decision. However, this decision would not be easy. Every time I thought about following this new path, a wave of fear and guilt invaded me. How could I abandon the faith that had sustained me my entire life? How would I face my family, my community, my own identity? I sought advice again from Father Michael. During our conversation, he noticed my hesitation and told me something that stuck in my mind. "Rashid, faith is not about what you leave behind, but about what you embrace. Jesus did not come to condemn, but to liberate. He is reaching out to you. It is up to you to decide whether you will hold it." That night, before bed, I knelt down in prayer for the first time, not as a Muslim, but as someone who was beginning to understand what it meant to pray in the name of Jesus. "If you are who you say you are, help me find my way. Guide me. I'm ready to follow wherever it takes me." The words came out of me with a sincerity I had never experienced before, and for the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully. After that night of prayer, I felt that something had changed within me. It was not an abrupt or dramatic change, but a deep calm, like a river finally finding its course. However, I knew there was still a step I needed to take to consolidate this new direction in my life. I spoke to Father Michael again, this time with more clarity in my decision. "Father," I began, "I believe I need to go one step further. I want to be baptized." He smiled, a smile that conveyed both joy and understanding. "Rashid, this is a deeply personal and spiritual decision. Let's do it when you are ready, without rushing. Baptism is a symbol of renewal, a commitment to live in Christ. Are you sure you are ready for this?" I shook my head affirmatively. Yes, I am. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like this is the path I should take. The preparation for the baptism was discreet. Father Michael suggested that we do it in a simple way, in the hospital itself, with few people present, just him, Daniel, and, to my surprise, Aisha. She didn't say much when I shared my decision, but she agreed to be present, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of love. On the appointed day, I dressed in simple clothes and sat in a small prayer room inside the hospital. Aisha sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, as Father Michael explained the meaning of baptism. Rashid, he said, this is a time of surrender and acceptance. It does not mean that your spiritual journey is over, but that it is just beginning. Are you ready? I nodded, and he began reciting the words while pouring water over my head. I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. The feeling was indescribable. As the water ran away, I felt like a monumental weight was being lifted from my shoulders. It was as if the void inside me was finally being filled. In the days following the baptism, something even more extraordinary happened. During the chemotherapy sessions, I realized that I felt different. The exhaustion and side effects began to subside. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence or a temporary improvement. But when doctors ordered further tests, what they discovered was nothing short of a miracle. Rashid, Dr. Collins said, entering the room with an expression of disbelief. I don't know how this is possible, but the tumors on his pancreas are regressing significantly. This is something we rarely see, especially in cases like yours. I knew exactly what had happened. It wasn't just the treatment, it was something much bigger. I shared the news with Aisha that night. She was incredulous, but also moved. Do you believe it was Jesus who healed you? She asked, her voice shaking. I looked at her and responded firmly. I believe he is the reason I am here, Aisha. I don't know what this means for us, but I know my life has been transformed. Despite physical healing and spiritual renewal, things were not easy. My decision to follow Christianity had difficult consequences. My family, especially the more conservative relatives, were outraged. Close friends began to grow apart, and even Aisha struggled to understand how our lives would change from there. Still, the peace I felt was unshakable. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was living with a greater purpose, guided by the truth I had found. My conversion to Christianity was not just a spiritual event. It was a complete redefinition of who I was, something my family and community had great difficulty accepting. Dearborn, with its rich Islamic heritage, was not only my physical home, but also the core of my cultural and social identity. Renouncing the Islamic faith was not just a personal choice, it was seen as a betrayal. The first to express this pain was Aisha. Despite having agreed to be present at my baptism, she could not hide the internal conflict she was facing. One night, after putting the kids to bed, she sat with me in the living room, her eyes teary. Rashid, she began, her voice wavering, I don't know who you are anymore. The man I married, who led our prayers, who taught Omar and Layla to recite the Quran? Where did he end up? I felt a pang in my heart. His words were not anger, but genuine pain. Aisha, I know this is difficult. I don't expect you to understand everything now. I just want you to know that this decision wasn't to hurt anyone. It was something I needed to do because I found a truth that I can't ignore. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face. What about us? Your family? How are we in all this? I didn't have an answer. All I could do was hold her hand and hope that, in time, she would see what I had found. The community's reaction was even more severe. The day a close relative found out about my conversion, the news spread quickly. Friends who used to frequent my store stopped showing up. Some even crossed the street to avoid greeting me. One afternoon, while organizing shelves, a longtime customer, Mr. Khalid, walked in. He was an older man, someone who always had great respect for me and my family. But that day, his gaze was full of disappointment. I'm Rashid, he said, his tone firm. What happened to you? How could you abandon your faith, your community, for something so foreign? I took a deep breath before responding. Mr. Khalid, I didn't abandon my faith. I just found a new path, something that resonated deeply with me. He shook his head, clearly dissatisfied. You're lost, Rashid. I hope you find your way back before it's too late. The The hardest moments were with my children. Omar, my oldest son, just 15 years old, started avoiding me. He barely spoke to me and spent hours locked in his room. Layla, my youngest, didn't fully understand what was happening, but she could sense the tension in the house. One night, I tried to talk to Omar. "Son, I know this is hard for you, but I want you to know that I'm still your father. I still love you." He looked at me, his eyes full of hurt. "You may be my father, but you're not the same man I knew. I don't know who you are anymore." Those words hit me like a blow. It was a painful reminder of the price I was paying for my choice. Despite all this, I found strength in my new faith. The peace I felt when praying in the name of Jesus was something that no rejection could take away. I started attending a small local church where I was warmly welcomed by people who understood my journey. It was there that I discovered that rejection, although painful, was part of the path for many who chose to follow a new faith. The support of the Christian community helped me get through the loneliest times. One member in particular, a woman named Sarah, shared her own story of conversion and family rejection. "Rashid," she said, "no matter how much you lose, what you have found is greater than all this. And in time, those who love you will begin to see the change in you. Be patient." These words were a reminder that my journey was just beginning, and that even in the shadows of rejection, there was light waiting for me. The months that followed were a period of transition, marked by challenges and discoveries. Although rejection from my family and community was painful, something within me remained unshakable. It was as if the peace I had found in my new faith was an anchor, holding me steady in the midst of the storm. My life has changed in many practical ways. The store, which was once the center of my life, became an empty place. With regular customers moving away, I decided to close it. Although this brought financial uncertainty, I felt it was the right decision. Little by little, I began to dedicate my time to something I had never considered before: helping people in vulnerable situations. At the church I started attending, there was a group of volunteers who worked at a local shelter. One day, Sarah, the woman who had supported me on my journey, asked if I would like to join them. "Rashid," she said, with an encouraging smile, "you have a powerful story. Maybe you can use it to help others who are also seeking hope." I hesitated, but accepted. The first time I went to the shelter, I felt out of place. It was a small but welcoming space, full of people facing their own kinds of suffering. As I served meals and listened to their stories, I realized something. Despite all the differences between us, there was a deep connection. We were all looking for something bigger, something that would bring meaning to our lives. In a particularly poignant moment, a man named Tom, who had been at the shelter for months, approached me. He was a large man, with a graying beard and eyes that seemed to carry years of pain. "You look different," he said, as I poured coffee. "What brought you here?" I smiled, hesitating for a moment. My life changed recently. I went through something that made me see the world in a completely new way. He nodded thoughtfully. "Change can be scary, but sometimes it's what we need to survive." His words stayed with me. Helping at the shelter has become more than an act of service. It became a way to find purpose. At home, things were still complicated. Aisha remained by my side, but our relationship was full of silences and tensions. One night, as we were sitting together, she finally broke the silence. "Rashid, I see you're different. I don't know if I understand or agree, but there's something about you now that seems calmer, more grounded." I looked at her, feeling a rush of emotion. "Aisha, all I want is for you to see what I see, for you to feel the peace I've found. I don't want to force you into anything. I just want you to know that I still love you." She held my hand, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also with something that seemed like hope. Despite the difficulties, my new faith brought unexpected fruits. Omar, my son, who had initially rejected me, began to observe my changes with curiosity. He still didn't talk to me much, but I would catch him watching me while I read the Bible or when I went out to help at the shelter. Layla, my youngest daughter, was the first to break the barrier. One night, while I was praying silently, she came into the room and sat down next to me. "Say, Daddy," she asked, her voice soft. "Are you happy now?" I looked at her, feeling the tears welling up. "Yes, Layla. For the first time in a long time, I am at peace," she smiled, hugging me. "Today, my life is not perfect, but it is more meaningful than it has ever been. Physically curing cancer was just the beginning. The real transformation happened within me when I realized that truth is not something we possess, but something that finds us when we are open to receive it. My journey continues. I still face challenges. I still struggle to build bridges with my family and my community. But the peace I found in Christ is something no one can take away from me. And for the first time, I feel like I'm truly alive.